Thank you, and welcome everybody to the 29th Woods Hole Film Festival. For those of you who are new to the film festival, generally the festival takes place each July, from the last Saturday of July through the first Saturday of August. It's an 8-day in-person event here in Woods Hole, Massachusetts, where I'm located. This year, for obvious reasons, having a live and in-person event, it was not possible, and we sort of figured in the middle of March that we would either have to decide to cancel the festival or to completely change how we present it. So this is our first virtual Woods Hole Film Festival. We are thrilled that we have 187 films selected from films submitted to us from around the world. And we have a stellar lineup. If you are a ticket holder or a pass holder, just one note of interest, we are planning to extend access to the festival films through Monday, August 3rd, to give people more time to see the films and more time to vote. Each film in this festival is eligible for both an audience award and a juried award. And so we hope that after you see the films, you will vote in the streaming platform. One of the things we do here at the Woods Hole Film Festival is try, when possible, to also have timely and important conversations in association with the films that we're screening. And you know, when we first started talking to Ben and the team at the Reunited States, we realized right away that this particular film, as with many of the films that we're showing this year, will resonate loudly and hopefully strongly with most people, not just in the United States, but many different places, to really engage in a thoughtful discussion around how we can heal our wounds and how we can come together and have both dialogue and meaningful action taken to potentially figure out how to get our country sort of back on track, if you will. And we could not be more excited and thrilled to have this incredible group of people with us today who've been working on these issues for many, many years. And so essentially the way things will work this afternoon is over the next 90 minutes, we're having this conversation. The first part of the conversation will be with the panel. The second part of the conversation, in about 35 or 40 minutes, we will open it up to questions from you, the audience. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A or the chat, and we will be happy to facilitate that. Also, just a reminder, please keep yourselves on mute throughout. And without further ado, let me welcome Ben Rekhi, who is the filmmaker and the team leader for the Reunited States. But I also will say, if we are not assuming that everyone has seen the film at this moment in time. But if you haven't, we hope that you will get a chance to see it through the end of the festival. So Ben, welcome, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thanks, Judy, and to the whole Woods Hole team and staff for persevering with a virtual festival. We find ourselves in strange times and are all in each our way trying to navigate this new reality. So it's very meaningful as an independent filmmaker to have this platform, and it's our world premiere. It's the first time we're sharing the film with audiences, and so we're excited to be a part of this panel and for all the amazing wisdom that these panelists bring in the bridge building space. I guess since the film might not everyone have seen it yet, I wanted to just share a clip, the opening 2 minutes from the film, and kind of set the stage in context for the themes that we're going to be discussing here. So why don't we start with that? I'll just share the screen and we'll be back with you in a moment.
Right now. We are as divided now as we were before the Civil War. And we're not really getting at the root causes. What we have today is a kind of party loyalty that is starting to transcend our loyalty to our country. What we're seeing today is dehumanizing who opposes us. If you ask people why they're a Republican or why they're a Democrat, it's because they hate the other party. It's like, why are they making
for us.
Divisions are happening in our neighborhood, they're happening in our schools, and they're happening in our families. It wasn't that they just had political disagreements, folks were physically attacking one.
Causes of division go all the way down into our foundation as a country.
And we're facing problems we've never faced before. See, all of us have to learn to be mediators. Stephen Olekara.
My name is Susan Grove.
I'm Greg Orman. I'm Mark Gerzon. I'm the author of the Reunited States of America. And I've been the bridge builder between Democrats and Republicans in the partisan divide for the last 30 years. It's not just in Washington, it's in our own hearts. Before we can fix government, we have to fix ourselves in the way we see our fellow citizens. And David Leverton, we decided to travel to all 50 states to get an understanding of what was causing these divisions. The real key to solving the partisan divide is within each of us as part of being a citizen of America. We are the solution. Ordinary citizens working across the divide every day to make this country a better place.
Conservative agenda, hate does not belong to either one.
We're always going to have liberals and conservatives in America. It's in our own interest to learn across the divide. We are the government. If we want to see a different government, the genius of America is that it's our responsibility to fix it. We need a narrative about the left and the right working together. This is something we have the power to change. This is something we have control over. I want to create a third force in our politics that's able to get us beyond this partisan warfare. This country needs people who have the courage to be pioneers, who are willing to get out of their comfort zone to bring both sides together. That's the path forward.
Okay, well, that's the opening to the film, and you know, really sets up the kind of major themes that the film talks about, that we each have a role to play in overcoming polarization. And so I thought I would just take a moment to let the panelists introduce themselves, just a quick one line with your name and your organization, and maybe at a top level what the organization does. So why don't we start with you, Mark, and then we'll run down the list.
I'm Mark Gerzon. I wrote the book House Divided 20 years ago, and the Reunited States a few years ago. And I'm a colleague of many of the people on this call, and a colleague of many of the people who were in the film, and excited to be part of this, Ben. Thank you.
Great. And Joan? Oops, I think it's still on mute.
I'm Joan Blades. I'm a co-founder of MoveOn.org and LivingRoomConversations.org. And Living Room Conversations is working to help make it possible for people all around the country to have conversations with people that have different viewpoints than they do, have good conversations.
Great. John?
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Ben. My name is John Wood Jr. I am a national ambassador for an organization called Braver Angels. Braver Angels is the largest grassroots bipartisan organization in America dedicated to the work of political depolarization. I'm very happy to say that I'm a friend of many of the people on this call. Glad to be in this company.
Thank you, John. And Pearce, why don't you go next?
Thanks, Ben. I'm Pearce Godwin, founder and CEO of Listen First Project and National Conversation Project. Our mission is to mend our frayed social fabric, both by building relationships and bridging divides with conversations that prioritize understanding, and to make the most of all these many people in the form of the Listen First Coalition to reach the mainstream beyond what any of us could do alone.
Thanks so much. And Tru?
Hello, everyone, and thanks for having me, Ben. And I, too, am honored to be alongside of all of these very influential people, so thank you. And I am the founder and chief bridge builder of True Access, which is an organization that helps people build bridges of trust and legitimacy across different divides, whether they be racial divides, generational divides, cultural divides, and relational divides of all kinds.
It's so great. A part of the, the experience of making this film has been to interact with people that are, actively trying to overcome our differences and heal our divisions. And, this journey started for me as, coming from a biracial family. My dad was an Indian immigrant. My mom was, East Coast American, and kind of, my dad leaned right, my mom leaned left. And so from a very young age was actively, bridging divides, whether I realized it or not. And, in 2016, when it happened, the election, a lot of us were trying to understand the new reality that we lived in afterwards and trying to see how our work could inform overcoming this sort of toxic polarization that was now on full display. And so for me, the idea of making the film was, where, instead of pointing their fingers at other people, like, what do each of us have to do with this division, and where are our own blind spots and our own prejudices that are actually might be fueling the fire instead of dissipating it. And I came up with this title, Reunited States, which led me to meeting Mark Gerzon, who had not only written the book with the same title, but on the same topic. And Mark has been doing this bridge building work and transpartisan work for a long time. And so I thought I'd throw it over to you, Mark, and just, maybe tell a little bit of how you came to this work. And then we'll also pull back more broadly and talk about, the documentary and its impact. But just starting with your short story of how you arrived to the work that you do.
Well, looking at the faces on the screen, I realized that for many years I've been surrounding myself with people who I felt were trying to heal this country. And that's, I think, something that we all share on this call. And so that process began in the 80s for me, continued in the 90s when I worked in communities, continued in the late 90s when I worked with the US Congress, and then it's continued into these decades where I've just watched this country really come apart in a fragmenting way. So for me, the way to stay on path and inspired and connected and hopeful was to surround myself with people like my colleague John Steiner, who's on this call, and Joan Blades, who you'll hear from in a moment, and Tru and John and Pearce and everybody else who's part of this movement. And I think I call it the movement to reunite America, because that was the original dream, and we've never achieved it, as the current crises, the multiple crises that we're facing show. And I guess just one more personal piece that, you mentioned, Ben, that you were, your parents were left and right. Well, my parents were divorced when I was 13. And I realized how challenging love is, that people could pick each other and still have trouble loving. And so if that's complicated, imagine how complicated it is to love our country. And so I'm really been meditating on this question for many years now, a quarter of a century. What does it mean to love our country, and how do we put it into practice? And I think this film is about people who have done that. They put their love for this country into practice, and that's why I'm excited to be a part of it, Ben.
Thanks so much. Yeah, Mark and I, was Mark really, had written this book, A Reunited States of America, How to Bridge the Partisan Divide. And, he wrote it in it got published in early 2016, before the election happened. And all of a sudden, these ideas of looking within to find the solutions, and, that it's not just about fixing government, that it's about, a role that we all have to play with civic engagement and civic discourse. That ability has been frittered away and lost over the last several years of, agreeing to disagree. And, the idea that we can find our fellow citizens as, worse enemies than some foreign nation. And one of the things that really stuck with me about Mark's work was the end of the Cold War sort of being the beginning of internal division. And that once we lost our enemy outside the country, we turned our enemies inside the country. And that's never stopped to this day. And it's a very dangerous for a democracy. And so, Joan, this might be a good place to come over to you, to your work. As someone who was the founder of MoveOn.org, which was, very sort of left-leaning organization. What led you to that? And then beyond that, to actually bridging the divide?
Actually, I'm a mediator by origin, and the original MoveOn petition was pretty unifying. It was last century, 98, midway in the impeachment scandal. And we're going, enough already with the impeachment. Let's censure and move on. And that petition went viral, and it had, thousands and thousands of Republicans as well as independents, because you could love Clinton or hate Clinton and agree that the best thing for the country was to censure and move on. So its founding invitation was one that was meant to appeal across the political spectrum. And I live in Berkeley, California. So there came a point where I'm going, what's going on here? And I had to be very intentional about talking to people with different viewpoints. And I was lucky enough to connect with Reuniting America, which is where I met Mark and some of the people on this call, and was able to have some really good conversations and connections with conservatives through that work. And my top issue was climate change. Why isn't everybody concerned about this? And I was able to kind of learn a lot through those conversations. By 2008, 2009, it was harder to do so. So Living Room Conversations was inspired by the fact that when people have good conversations with each other, when they connect in a personal way, all of a sudden you can start seeing pathways to, working together. I just, wrote an op-ed with a friend about COVID, because it's not about our health or our economy. We have to have both. And if we can't get that, we've got to be in connection. And like Mark said, it's about being able to love each other. And it's to love each other even when we don't agree on something.
Great. I should also just take a moment to introduce Erin Sorensen, who's on the call with us. She is our impact producer from the film, and sort of a good segue into the broader conversation that we'll have with everyone here about how a documentary can reach and make a difference, do more than just entertain and hopefully shed light on certain issues, but actually make an impact in a community. So Erin is here with us. I just wanted to give you a quick shout out. If there's anything you want to say, otherwise we can kind of continue and ask any questions as they come up.
Sorry, no, I'm good. You covered it.
Okay. So Judy, did you want to ask anything more broadly about the film?
Yeah, well, so just about this case study and the conversation that we're having right now. I mean, in this festival, we have many, many documentaries that talk about a variety of issues. And so one of the questions always is, relative to this particular film, how do you make a documentary film about a broad social topic that's going to be of interest to varied audiences and that will ultimately be used as a learning and advocacy tool by different parties? And sort of, is that the intention of this film? And how do you know what the impact ultimately is? How do we measure impact?
Well, I think if I knew how ambitious and difficult it was going to be to try and make a film about arguably the most pressing issue of our time, I might not have even began, because it was pretty foolish to think that you could capture everything in a film. But what we realized through the process was that we knew we wanted to follow a handful of stories to show that there wasn't just one solution to this problem, that there's multiple different solutions. And we kind of started to look at it like a mountain that everyone is trying to climb. And you might take, this path or this path, but it reaches the same place, which is this deeper understanding of each other. And that hopefully by seeing this invisible thread through multiple stories, that it might hold a mirror up to you, the audience, and say, well, what am I doing about this problem? And so, in as much as it's, a piece of entertainment of watching other people, we really hope that it's a piece of self-reflection. And, we all need a little bit of self-reflection in this moment, no matter where we are on the journey, to say, are my thoughts, words, and actions helping the problem or hurting the problem? And so, media has a different incentive, which has been used to divide us. And it's usually because there's a profit motive behind it for advertising. It's clickbait. It gets you to keep watching, very, very scary and fear-based journalism and media. And so there's not a lot of messaging out there like this, and which is, there is a solution and you're part of it. And so our hope is that will resonate with people, because it's a universal truth. And I think the heart kind of recognizes that when it's spoken, but it's just not very spoken. It's drowned out a lot. This might actually be a good place to go to John Wood Jr., kind of coming from, a media background and presently as well with the podcast and everything like that. Is there anything you can add, watching the film and just in general from your own experiences?
Yeah, sure. Well, Ben, when you visited me to, do a little bit, to grab a couple of clips for the documentary and so forth, you had asked me the question, sort of, what is a personal kind of story that kind of on-ramps your involvement in this movement? And that's always a hard question for me to answer, because being a person who comes from a family background that is multicultural, biracial, my father's white, my mother's black, but my father is also from the South. He's a baby boomer. He is a Republican. My mother is younger, born midway into the 60s and so forth, liberal Democrat from the inner city. I was always a bit of a translator between my parents' experiences. But one of the things I remember early in life is this sort of, there's been some talk about divorce here. Mark, you mentioned it. Ben, you mentioned it. My parents divorced early. One of my original memories in life of the two of them interacting was them just sort of constantly arguing and shouting at each other. And as a little kid, I can remember sort of standing in between them in my parents' living room and putting my hands over my ears and saying, "Stop shouting at each other," And so I feel like I've kind of been doing that sort of thing ever since, I guess, so this pathological need to try and get people to actually listen to each other. Shout out to Pearce Godwin, of course. People need to listen first, right? And so the problem with the media is that the mainstream and the political media, cable news, talk radio, and so much of what we take in is that it doesn't sort of emphasize that as a value. It doesn't emphasize that as a practice. To live in a diverse, democratic society, we have to be able to take in one another's experiences so we can find the human commonality and communicate across those. And so in Braver Angels' work with the podcast, et cetera, we try and create media messaging that has that sort of an emphasis and use that to create momentum towards the actual sorts of on-the-ground interactions that allow us to make practice out of that emphasis. And so, that's sort of how I come into it. And the spectrum of people doing that is amazing and well represented in this conversation.
That's great. I want to hear from Pearce and Tru as well, but I think in this moment, I'm just going to take a minute to show the other clip from the film that includes everyone here, just to give a fuller picture of the work that you all are doing. So give me one moment and we'll share the screen and optimize the sound this time. So this should be a little bit better. Okay, here we go. Whoops. That's the wrong one. Oh my God. Sorry, that was the wrong clip. Hold on one second.
I'm Bill Doherty. I'm one of the co-founders of Better Angels.
I'm Joan Blades, and I'm a co-founder of Room Conversations.
My name is Tru Peddigrew, and I am the founder of Tru Access. What started off as conversations that involve law enforcement and the Black community has expanded significantly to include all walks of life.
I'm Pearce Godwin. I founded the Listen First Project.
I'm Rob Willer here at Stanford, and I'm the director of the Polarization and Social Change Lab.
My name is Kristen Hansen. Mismatch is enabling students all around the country to engage in respectful conversation on difficult topics.
Better Angels is bringing conservatives and liberals together to depolarize America.
My name is Masa Kalima.
I'm John Gable.
My name is John Wood Jr. as an African-American Republican, maybe I could build the bridge between the two sides of the political conversation and also in the racial conversation.
Our responsibility is to really listen.
The Listen First movement is about bridging divides with conversation.
People tend to distance themselves from the problem of polarization. I think the truth is that we're all a part of this, but it's also good news in that we could be a part of the solution.
A lot of spaces where we are divided is rooted in fear. Simply put, we can choose courage.
There is a huge desire among human beings to connect.
We all want the same thing, and we're so much more alike than we are different.
So we created the Bridge Alliance, which is now a network of over 100 organizations.
Mismatch is part of a much bigger movement that's underway in our country right now to break down divides.
There's a whole bridging movement all around the country that are doing wonderful work.
And with 1,000 different organizations in the U.S. today working to bridge divides.
We invite everyone to join the thousands who have already signed the Listen First pledge.
There's almost the right organization for any American who wants to get involved.
Okay, I apologize for any of the audio and video issues you might be experiencing, but Tru, you know, your story is remarkable of how you came to work, particularly with law enforcement on some of these bridging issues. Can you tell us briefly what brought you to that work and what that work is?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ben. Growing up in Baltimore, I was on the receiving end of some bad experiences with law enforcement, just personally, involving excessive force. I spent some time living in LA, had more bad experiences with law enforcement to the point where I was leaving a convenience store. Police pulled up, grabbed me, threw me to the ground, put his gun to my head and taunted me and suggested that, you know, his words would give me a reason, I wish you would. And I didn't even know why this was taking place. And it turned out that they had received a call of a recent or a nearby 7-Eleven had recently been robbed, and I fit the description. And so I had some bad experiences with law enforcement growing up. And then if you fast forward to 2014, when the incident took place in Ferguson, Missouri with Officer Darren Wilson and Michael Brown, and at this point, I'm older, I have a son of my own, and I live in Cary, North Carolina, predominantly white, relatively affluent community. And I was concerned for my own son's safety. And the irony is, as I was concerned for his safety as it related to law enforcement, and I didn't know how to keep him safe and protected from law enforcement, knowing the things that had happened to me in my own life and seeing all of the things that were filling up my news feed and social media with the Michael Brown incident in Ferguson, and other incidents had happened as well. And so out of a concern and a desire to protect my son from any of these same incidents happening to him, I went down to the local police department here in Cary, North Carolina, to get a sense and an understanding from Cary PD as to where they stood on what I perceived to be social injustices towards people that look like me across the nation. And that started a conversation. And that conversation led to a relationship where I was then tasked and challenged to work with the Cary PD to help them build bridges of trust and legitimacy with other people in the Black community that may have felt and believed the same things that I felt and believed about the Cary PD and the profession overall. And so that work with Cary PD and building bridges in the Black community spread from Cary to Raleigh to Apex, and just throughout the state, throughout the region where I live, and then throughout the state, and then eventually throughout the country, across the country. And so the work that started with law enforcement has since expanded to working with churches and corporations and sports teams and municipalities and you name it. But it's really rooted in helping people understand how to hear diverse perspectives in an effort to co-create and collaborate environments that are inclusive and comfortable, where we all feel as though we can thrive and be our authentic selves.
That's amazing. And I should probably say that we have a bunch of clips that we're going to be releasing in the run up to the release that go deeper with each of your guys' stories. And the fact that you host these conversations in barbershops, of many places, but it's a real intimate environment where people feel comfortable, and creating that safe space to have a discussion seems so important. And Pearce, that might be a good place to go to the work that you do about, creating this environment and this safe space. So first, briefly, Pearce, a little bit about your story, what led you to see this division and as a stalemate and as something that, was not going anywhere, and how you found your role into this conversation and leading the movement that you do.
Yeah. In July 2013, right at 7 years ago, I was on an overnight bus ride across Africa. I'd spent 6 months over there with the Christian International Development Organization. I had most recently left DC, where I was working in the US Senate and in Republican politics. John and I have that in common. And I wanted to step out of that just to gain a fresh perspective on life, something bigger than myself. And suffice it to say, I did. After those 6 months, I was very much looking forward to returning home to North Carolina, but I was seeing some headlines that were deeply troubling. There was news that my own community here in North Carolina had recently been gripped, even then, by this same rancor and vitriol that I thought I had left behind in Washington. So unable to sleep on that bus ride, I wrote this little, what I thought was a blog post called "It's Time to Listen," but that message jumped over the ocean, was printed in dozens of newspapers across the U.S., from the Miami Herald to the Oklahoman and beyond. And I found myself really emboldened by the resonance of such a simple idea. So with that, I launched, Listen First Project to, as I mentioned earlier, mend our frayed social fabric by building relationships and bridging divides. And, honestly, as I look back, and we all have our own, story and what drew us here, and that's what, it's so good to hear from my friends. I don't think I'd personally be on the mission without those 6 months in Uganda. I'd witnessed heartbreaking material poverty, but was equally moved by the level of relational wealth. And it was against that backdrop that I gazed back across the ocean at here we are, the most materially prosperous nation in the world, and was utterly heartbroken by America's relational poverty. And remember, again, that bus ride was right at 7 years ago, which feels almost quaint relative to the division and brokenness that we're experiencing today. Beyond that starkly juxtaposed experience in my life, my faith is ultimately what drives me. So while that's my story, I think what we're all seeing now is that as our social plague has worsened, as more and more Americans are having a moment, as I did in Africa, we're all realizing in our own way that this American experiment is never going to reach its aspiration as this shining city on a hill, casting beacon lights of freedom, equality, and opportunity, unless we do what this film is encouraging us to do, unless we find a better way to relate with one another. I think more of us are looking at the current culture and relational norms just right around our own local communities and saying, this has got to change. And I'm committed to be a part of that change. And I just want to encourage everybody that's here, hearing our stories, hearing the stories from the film, that just by being here, by watching this film, you're beginning that journey with us. And I'm so immensely grateful that you are.
Thanks, Pearce. That just brought up just a lot of, emotions that I think we all feel. It's a very emotional time, regardless of where we are on the political spectrum. And there's this sort of illusion or sense that, if we can just defeat the other side, or that we're, on the right side of history, or the right side of an issue, and this illusion that somehow, that we'll, be able to defeat like an enemy in a war. But there's tens of millions of Americans that think differently than you do or I do, just based on, the sheer numbers. And it brings me back to John Wood Jr., how did the family counseling aspect of the work that you guys do become applied to political divisions?
Mm-hmm. Right. So that comes, well, first of all, that's sort of the foundation of the beginning of our work. It comes to us through the contributions of Professor Bill Doherty, who was featured in some of the clips that you showed. Bill Doherty is a professor from the University of Minnesota, and one of the foremost family therapists in America. He's a co-founder of Braver Angels. In the clips, by the way, you'll hear him say Better Angels. Our name changed to Braver Angels earlier this year. So Braver Angels has a multitude of different formats and workshops for bringing people together, but it started with a workshop model that was about bringing together small groups of Americans from the right and from the left, or reds and blues, as we say in-house, conservatives, liberals, not so much to argue or debate politics, but to speak from the vantage point of their own personal experience in terms of why they saw politics the way that they did. So yes, it is literally marriage counseling applied to the relationships between Republicans and Democrats. And the interesting thing about Bill is that Bill vocationally is a family therapist, but he's a person who's steeped in the history of democracy, in the practice of citizenship. He's a person with a strong background in organizing. And so it makes sense that these things would go together, because ultimately the main thing that we've lost sight of in America, in my opinion, is the fact that all of our political progress, all of our economic progress is built upon the foundation of Pearce, which you so eloquently described as our relational wealth, or in other words, the culture of connection that exists between the American people themselves. If there is not a sense of civic trust, a sense of essential sort of a basic culture of friendship that exists between the American people across these divisions, then there's no foundation for us to build politically, socially, and economically together. Because without that trust being present, everything that we do in politics is going to be aimed at completely undermining the very sort of essential existence, if you will, of folks on the other side. And in that context, there's no room for anything constructive to take place. So, through that marriage counseling sort of approach, we're trying to get at the roots of the split in our relationships to fix the foundation of our society from the bottom up.
Well, and Ben, if I could jump in and just say that the characters that are missing on this screen today are are David and Aaron Leverton. And I just want to say that they illustrate kind of what John was saying, in the sense that you picked, Ben, as your primary sort of vehicle for the film, a couple in which who definitely lean conservative. They're Christian. They have a Republican background, and it's really a story. One of the pieces that goes through the film is their story of how they evolved, and they're still conservative. They're still Christian, and they're probably still Republican. But there was a way in which their hearts opened in this film that really touches on what John was saying. And I just want to stress what I thought was a brilliant choice on your part, picking them as the vehicle. Because when I was listening to Tru and John and Joan and Pearce, I thought, gosh, I wish they all had more screen time. And of course they don't, partly because of the choices you made. And I just want to say, I think the choice you made was a tough one, but I think the right one, because that evolution that they had, particularly around the issue of race, I find very moving. And I want to just underscore, since this, in this film festival context, there is no other film I know that traces a character like David and Aaron Leverton. They just never get on the screen. They never come alive on the screen, because we're always seeing somebody on the right or the left shouting at the other people. So for you to be able to dive deeper into their story and your other characters, I think was a brilliant choice, and illustrates what John was saying, because it's not exactly family therapy, but it's a family that's going through a therapeutic process of learning how to love this country better, learning how to love this country better.
No, thank you, Mark. I agree. Like, we realized in the end, these are very, what feels like heady and academic like topics of solutions, but ultimately it's a heart revolution that we all need to undergo. And there's no stronger way to change people's minds than through their hearts. And so, really looking at the film as emotional moments and character moments that you could relate to just from a basic storytelling perspective really became the guiding principle and light. If we don't move people, if you're not engaged emotionally with this journey, then you won't even set foot on it. And so I appreciate that and agree with you. One of the other things, buried in the film is hopeful solutions, not just talking about the problems, but seeing people in action, getting outside of their bubble. We all live in such bubbles now where people around us, we've sorted ourselves. Everyone thinks, acts, and speaks like we do. And so to understand where people are coming from, which is, Tru, you said this beautifully in your piece, we all want the same things, and that there's a lot more common ground, and we're more alike than we are different. Can you talk a little bit about how you curate that kind of atmosphere in the work that you do?
It's through facilitated dialogue. I don't think people realize that because they don't take the time to truly listen to understand. When people are at what they believe to be different viewpoints or at odds with one another, they do what we call competitive listening. You're only listening to reply. You want to, it's like double dutch. You're just waiting for your chance to jump in there, to tear down their argument or find holes in whatever it is they said to defend your position. But when it's facilitated dialogue and all of the conversation is directed towards me, being truly a person that's there that only seeks to, my only agenda is the greater good of all. I'm not at odds with you, I'm not at odds with you. I am facilitating the conversation, and now the person over here is listening to understand, and we set that environment, we set that climate. They're not listening to reply. And then the revelation takes place organically, where there's a realization that, oh wow, there's so much more that connects us than we should be allowing to divide us, and that we have allowed to divide us. And the recognition that it's through these diverse perspectives and these diverse life experiences that we can then leverage the collective intelligence and the collective shared experiences to collaborate on the best solution for how we can coexist and move forward. And I don't want to oversimplify something that obviously has a lot of complexity to it, but it really is about a willingness. And I think that is the biggest barrier, a willingness to sit down and have a conversation and listen to understand. And that is, I think, what can compel us or catapult us to a place of greatness and achieving what we are seeking to achieve, is people's willingness to overcome those barriers of just taking a moment to consider, oh wow, there just may be some validity to what Joan is saying. There just may be some validity to what Pearce is saying, what Mark is saying, what John is saying. If we just allow ourselves that space to have that as a consideration, then we allow ourselves to be much more informed, and then develop the levels of empathy. Because if I understand how you feel, but not just how you feel, but why you feel the way that you feel, now I'm developing the necessary levels of cognitive empathy, emotional empathy, and compassionate empathy that will compel me to take action to eliminate the source of pain that is causing all of us so much pain.
Can I just jump in here for a second and just remind the audience that if you have questions, please type them into the chat or the Q&A, but we have a question, if you don't mind. James Woods Jr., you spoke about trusting our political leaders, but I truly have a hard time trusting a leader who talks out of both sides of his mouth. How do we get past that issue? I know people who believe that he speaks the truth implicitly, and I believe he is the biggest liar on the face of the earth. How do we get past that? And, you know, I think that's also part of a broader question, which is whose truth is the truth in this day and age when we're talking about viewpoints, not facts, viewpoints. How do we get people to believe what somebody else is saying is actually true?
So I think that question is for me. I'm John Wood Jr., not James, but that's quite all right.
Sorry, I was reading.
No, not a problem. So yeah, in my comments, I actually didn't say anything about trusting political leaders, and there's a reason for that. There's a distinction to be drawn. Of course, we would like to trust our political leaders, but when I talk about the need for us to build up sort of a civic trust between the American people, I'm talking specifically about you and your neighbors. I'm talking specifically about you and your family members. I'm talking specifically about you and your classmates, coworkers, children, etc. And the reason for that is because it is those relationships that provide the foundation upon which our politics is based, right? And so if we distrust each other, and if there's, you know, gain to be had from the distrust of the American people, politicians will tend to cater to that, right? On the other hand, if the American people bind together in a way that says, look, we want to build together, we want to transcend these differences, then we will demand a politics that reflects that. And so that's sort of the pattern that we need to reverse. But on the subject of whose truth is true and what do we do when we have politicians who say things that strike so many of us as just blatantly untrue, if the primary goal of what it is we're talking about here is rebuilding this culture of trust amongst the American people, then we have to realize that that doesn't really begin with agreement on individual political facts. People want to talk about facts a lot, and I understand that. But every fact is itself subject to a subjective interpretation, depending on the individual or the particular group examining it. And so to get to something that Tru said, Tru talked about how we need to, in engaging with each other, signal the fact that we're not just sort of listening competitively, we're trying to arrive at a greater sort of understanding of each other for the common good, for the general good. That ties into something that Martin Luther King Jr. emphasized very much in the philosophy of nonviolence. The philosophy of nonviolence is rooted in part in this idea that we pursue truth and justice and freedom, not just for the sake of folks who may be oppressed or marginalized in a circumstance, but even for the sake of those people who might be standing in the way of social progress. And the reason for that is because, as Dr. King explained, the objective of nonviolence was not to humiliate or defeat the opponent, but rather to win his friendship and to be reconciled to him at the end of the day. If we are able to signal to the people that we disagree with that we ultimately are seeking their good as well, then we demonstrate the fact that we are not truly their enemies. And if we can demonstrate that fact, that creates the emotional and psychological space for a genuine listening, a genuine open-mindedness to the things that we have to say and to the concerns that we express, because we are showing that same open-mindedness to the things that they feel, the things that they need to express. And in that kind of a culture of empathy that Tru, you illustrated it so well, there then becomes the possibility for us to achieve a more material sort of agreement on just what the facts governing our reality actually are. But so long as we are pitted in tribal animosities that prevents us from listening earnestly to each other, we'll never be able to get there, and we will never be able to demand the sort of politics from our leaders that could reflect that.
Thank you. Does anyone else want to comment? I mean, this is a very broad topic, and I'm sure.
I would just add that, the listening piece of this is the power of listening is something we're all speaking to, and it's that connection. If we're focused on persuasion, then we're not doing the listening we need to do. And I think the truth of the matter is it's taken us time to get here, which is a very divided space, and it's going to take us time to come back together, and we're looking for a mass movement. That's why all of us on this call, and we're all in connection with each other. This is a bridging movement. And it's actually a domestic peace movement. Because if we don't take this moment and say, this is not where we want to go, we want to be in right relationship with our neighbors and with our community, and not just our local community, but our national community, then, we lose our capacity to respond appropriately to all sorts of things. And it's going to be our undoing. So I'm super grateful for everyone here on this call and the work they're doing, and for this documentary to give us a platform in which to invite people in and start these conversations in all these different spaces.
I fundamentally believe that it's up to us as individuals, starting with me, because I wear the bracelet, but I'm still really bad at it, to create this change and turn this tide. There are certainly leaders. We may disagree on which ones are most to blame. It doesn't particularly matter to me. There are certainly leaders who foment our divisions, who play to our more base instincts of us versus them tribalism. That is certainly unhelpful. It's certainly harmful. But I think ultimately this changes from the bottom up, that it's got to be each of us in our communities, in our relationships, because no president or other national leader created this. And so I really try to start by looking in the mirror and seeing how we can create a culture and an atmosphere and an incentive structure for our leaders, for our cultural leaders, not just political, to be giving us what we want, and what we want no longer being what unfortunately does work in many cases today.
I read a book recently that talks about how news is all about what we fear, what gives us anxiety, and what makes us angry. That's what the news focuses on, and we have to make a choice. John Gable, who's also part of what Ben was showing there, is All Sides, which is news from across the political spectrum. Well, across the political spectrum also, those are the stories that travel. So how do we take ownership of what we let into our lives and how it impacts us? We haven't solved this, but together we can figure it out.
Mark, did you want to jump in here?
I just want to say, Kathy's question about trusting political leaders, the fact that we can't trust our political leaders, I think highlights why Ben focused the story the way he did, which the illusion that the Obama figure or the Bush figure or the Clinton figure or the Reagan figure is going to solve it for us, I think it's finally kind of, it's fading. And each of them have promised to unite America. Going back to Reagan, I think is the first president I quote in my book. They've all promised to be a uniter, not a divider, to quote George Bush. They've all promised, to work for America, not the red states or the blue states, to quote Obama. And I think it's pretty clear that, and the whole Listen First movement is really about, no, we've got to do it. Yes, we might get good leaders. We might get bad leaders, but meanwhile, we've got to do it. And so this movement, and that's why I like the fact that Ben did not focus his cameras inside the Beltway. Yes, he shot Stephen Olakara inside the Beltway because that's where Millennial Action Project is active, but his focus is on ordinary citizens, and whether it's a family in Dallas or a heroic community leader in North Carolina like Tru, or he's focusing it on the ground, and I think that's really exciting, and that's why I think there's a series here. My guess is that this film will catalyze a lot of interest in the media world, and they're going to start saying, hey, there's a series here, there's a show here, there's a sitcom here, there's legs to this. There's something exciting about this, because it's actually much more exciting than the 300th time when you watch somebody on the left and right shout at each other on PBS NewsHour. So I'm excited that Ben focused the camera where he did. And Kathy, that's why I would say, no, you can't trust your leaders. Let's trust ourselves and learn to trust our neighbors.
So we have a number of questions. Do you mind if we move on to the next? Or Tru, did you want to jump in before we move on?
No, we can go ahead and move on.
So would the panel comment on so-called call-out culture? Thanks, great conversation about this important work. And I don't know if somebody wants to define what call-out culture means first.
If I could, and I don't want to speak for this person, but I think there are two things there that may be one and the same. And there's definitely cancel culture, right? Which is what I'm thinking they may be alluding to. And again, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but if I'm hearing them correctly, that they are one and the same, where we're constantly calling people out to the point where we will try to publicly shame and embarrass them, to cancel them, to encourage other people or influence other people, as Joan talked about, to make sure that they are no longer relevant, to strip them of their power and influence. And I think that contributes to the division that we're seeing. Simply, if someone is not in agreement with you, or if someone is operating out of their ignorance, or even if someone has made a mistake, I don't think the answer to ignorance is condemnation. I think we're all, to a large degree on this call, we're educators. And being educators, we all know that the solution to ignorance is education. And then the solution to mistakes is correction. And then the solution to misconduct is condemnation. We should condemn and correct oppression and condemn misconduct. But if we go straight to condemning ignorance, that just creates more division and pushes us further apart. And so I would suggest that we call people in initially, right? Instead of calling them out, call them into a conversation to get an understanding of why they feel the way that they do. And it may be as simple as educating them to fill that void of ignorance that exists versus create, because it is a heart condition, as someone referenced earlier, that the change takes place in the heart. We can, as a trainer, I can train police departments, I can train teachers, I can train people all day, every day. But if their heart's not right, it's not going to make a difference. If their heart has been hardened, it's not going to make a difference. If they have resentment and malice in their heart, it is not going to make a difference. So instead of calling people out, I encourage others to call people in to a conversation to get an understanding, and then follow that process of educating ignorance, correcting mistakes, and then, if necessary, condemning misconduct.
Many of the organizations in this space have their top 10 tips or conversation agreements, as Joan has, and looking at so many of those over time, I've tried to distill out, what I see as the 4 that are most important. One of them, I think, speaks directly to this. The other 3 are: listen first to understand, be curious and open to learning, and maximize diversity of perspectives. But the one that I think hits this is suspend judgment and extend grace. And I'm just not seeing much extension of grace happening. Benefit of the doubt, and gentle correction and calling in. True, I love how you put that. So for me, that's what I go back to, is that in our own lives, again, starting with me, extending that grace to one another, seeing that common humanity instead of lashing out, which simply doesn't get us anywhere towards solving this particular problem. Shame somebody, maybe. Let them know something's no longer okay. Sure, but ultimately, what have we gained if we're not extending grace and drawing people in to a common understanding of humanity?
Just want to bring it over to John Wood Jr. for a moment. I realize he had a conflict starting now. We're going to stay on for a little bit longer, but John, do you want to say any closing remark before you bow out here?
Yeah, I do. Tru, again, I appreciate your framing here, because this is a heart condition, folks. And I think that the thing that we all have in common, and that anybody who's really serious about the kind of work that we're doing and the movement that was illustrated in the documentary, and for anybody who hasn't seen it, it really is a work of art. It's a work of art that ties directly into the spirit of change that we hope to see here. Is that, it is, you have to embrace the difficulty of what it is this moral challenge calls upon us to do. It calls upon us to set our own egos aside in order to take on board the feelings and sometimes the anger or sometimes the ignorance of other individuals who we do not understand, and who in many cases may not like us and certainly do not understand us to start off with. But by standing in that gap, by standing in that space, we're able to show those people the best in ourselves in a way that allows us to communicate, I think, communicate a more optimistic vision in terms of what's possible in the United States of America as a family, as a community. And on the other hand, by listening in the way that Joan and Pearce and others have emphasized, we open up the space for ourselves to become edified, right? You have to abandon the idea that you know everything, We have to abandon the idea that we have all the answers, and embrace this sense that it really is love in the form of goodwill that allows us to transcend the things that divide us. And so humility is our tool here. It's not just the facts, it's not the best arguments, It's being willing to take the time to hear what somebody else genuinely has to say, And that's where we have to start. So I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all you folks today. And Ben and everybody else, keep up the incredible work.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
Take care now.
We do have a couple more questions in the Q&A. Phil White says, really interested by Joan's point, the film galvanizes the need for a peace movement within our local communities. What steps should be taken to facilitate that?
I think we're all saying that the steps, everyone can take a step, and what all of us are trying to provide is different tools for taking those steps. And, the living room conversations We had in-person and by video conversations. Right now, they're all by video, right? But you can have a really meaningful conversation with your friends, with your neighbor. You can be intentional about inviting people you're concerned about, and you can talk about connective issues to start with, because you don't need to start by talking about something that's hard. And once you start to feel, close to someone, then you hear them with a lot more empathy. And we have over 100 conversation guides, so that that facilitated conversations are powerful and wonderful. But when you don't have a facilitated conversation arranged or next door, this is a tool for you to take and run yourself. But there's so many ways to do it. And so I leave it to Pearce and Tru and Mark to add to this story now.
Well, I'll just add this, if I could, Joan, that one of the principles of community organizing is start where you are with what you have. So I'd say to your questioner, do what Tru did. Tru started where he was with what he had. He was a father with a son in a police department in North Carolina, and look what he's done. So that principle of start where you are with what you have, I think, is a really good one. And if people want to be inspired, go to the Bridge Alliance, for example, where Joan's organization, many of the organizations are listed, and you'll see, over 100 different people who said, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to start this, I'm going to start that. And so whether you join an existing organization or whether you start your own, I'd share that principle, start where you are with what you have. And there's a lot of people who are busy, trying to call their congressman and all that. I think that's great. We need to affect Washington. It's important. But the bottom line is, you've got the power of whoever you are, whether you're a nurse or a doctor or a teacher or a mother or wherever you are, you've got some power, and the place to use it is right where you are. And there's lots of allies. That's the good news. Maybe 20 years ago, you'd feel like you were alone doing it, but if you follow the leads present in the film and present on this conference call, this Zoom call, you'll find a home for yourself to get involved. And if you don't, you'll find the support to start something of your own.
In the spirit of doing more together than we could do separately, everybody you've heard from on this call is currently leading a campaign explicitly geared around what we can each do in our communities. We thought April would mark the 3rd annual National Week of Conversation. That quickly seemed imprudent as the pandemic came to our shores. So the whole field, 100 leaders got on the call. What are we going to do? Pivoted to a crisis response campaign. So in partnership with New York Times columnist David Brooks and his Aspen Institute Weave Project, one of the newer partners in the space, we're all together leading this Weaving Community campaign at weaving.us. It's about celebrating acts of bravery, caring, and connection that heal the pain and weave the future we want. Our overarching goal across all the organizations behind this campaign is to inspire millions of Americans of all stripes to start or deepen relationships in their communities. So I would certainly invite all of you to visit weaving.us. Pin yourselves on the national map. You'll see there. Let us know what you're doing. Let the world know. It doesn't really matter about us, frankly, but inspire others to weave community, as we say, in their own communities. Share the campaign on social media and just invest in those relationships and Joan's work and John's work. There's so many actions there on that Get Involved page to plug you in with the organizations and with the kind of actions and resources that can make all of us more effective in this work.
Tru, would you like to jump in?
No, I can't say it any better than it's already been said. And I love the way that Mark put it, is start where you are with what you have. And we all have the capacity, the opportunity daily to affect change. And I go back to the point of a willingness. If you're willing to do the things that other people won't do, it's going to come with resistance and it's going to come with pushback. So just kind of know that going in. But that's what it takes, because we all have different gifts, talents, and abilities. But that alone is not what's going to catapult us to achieve the change and transformation that we seek. It's the willingness to do the things that other people typically won't do. And so starting where you are with what you have, I think Mark I echo that and couldn't say it any better.
Thank you. So this next question is for Ben. Are you hopeful that this tide of division will turn soon? After making this film, has it transformed your perspective?
Yeah, it absolutely has. You know, whether it will turn soon or how long it will take, you know, to turn is up to each of us. I think part of what inspired this was that this affects every single one of us. Like, we've all lost a family member or a friend or a colleague over political divisions in the past few years. People that we drop from Facebook or block, you know, it's like a loved one that, you know, our identity is wrapped up in, that we disagree so much because we can't understand how someone that we identify with so closely could disagree so vehemently. And so it's really, you know, we can't control the thoughts of other people or even what our political leaders say, but we can control how we react. And the level of anger and fear and emotional outrage is self-destructive as well. And there's, you know, we're not saying you don't have to not be passionate about your issues, and you can have very passionate discussions about them. But once those passions overwhelm you, there's a lot of damage they can do to not only the conversation and other people, but to yourself. And so in a self-interested way, I think there's a real need for this. You know, we're going through one of the most difficult times as a country in a generation, not just, you know, arguably with political chaos on both sides, but also that the pandemic and the economic fallout and the divisions that are stoked from that, and this primal sort of, I need to look out for me and mine, is actually hardwired in our nature for survival. And the thing that makes us human is our ability to reason and to transcend that primal emotion and those instincts. And so it's incredibly difficult work. We're not saying this is easy. This is by no means like a kumbaya, let's come together and just work through our differences. Like, this is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. We're at this tumultuous point in history where it can really fall apart, or we can piece it back together. And each of us has a role. And that's why there's a sense of agency that I feel now, which is, you know, what can I do in my own little, you know, community or conversation? You know, the people that come into your sphere of influence, that's the only place where you have any influence. And so you can't fix all of the problems, but what are the daily things? What are we saying to each other that we have control over? And so I guess the big part of this was just a call to action to say, like, you're not hopeless in this. Like, you know, our political leaders have an agenda they want you to fear because it gets them votes. You know, the news media wants you to continue to watching. It's really up to you to decide how much you want to opt into these things. It's not a given that you have to feel what they want you to feel. And so I would also argue that we're not as divided as we're portrayed to be. You know, the news media kind of highlights the extreme voices on either side. Our 1,000 or so elected officials in Washington are not 300 million of us, and they have different incentives to be agitated and divided. And so there's a lot of data that supports that we're not actually as divided as we're told. And so, yes, I'm hopeful. I don't think it's going to be easy work, but it's work that we all have to do.
So I think that sort of leads into the next question, which is changing the narrative. I mean, who's in control of the narrative that we're living in right now? That's one issue. But this question is sort of, you know, the conversations in this that will stem from this film are important. They'll be ongoing. It's not like you're just going to roll out the film. It'll be out there. It'll be done. In order for it to have a longer term impact, you're going to need to unspool it over time. And especially now, the way that's going to happen is even more challenging. But the question is, will the panelists and you sort of be out there together using this film as a starting point for conversation?
Yeah, we've always hoped that the film would be an invitation to the conversation. We knew that we weren't going to be able to tackle this, you know, huge subject in 90 minutes. But, you know, hopefully it serves as an on-ramp for people, and that it spurs a sense of, you know, what can I do, or I want to know more. I didn't even know this movement was out there, type of thing. And so by that, we would love to, you know, if it's, you know, having like conversations in your living room with people, you know, and a curated guide where it's like, here's actually how to have this, and here's ground rules like that we follow to not let it spiral out of control. And, you know, Tru brought up this idea of competitive listening. I'd never heard that term, but that's so true, that like, we're just waiting to attack and that, you know, we have control over, but by relinquishing that control, maybe that's also part of why we're here. And so I just, yeah, it's an on-ramp, like whatever speaks to people, that this could be, you know, just the beginning of the journey for folks.
Well, my dream for the film, Ben, is that when it comes out, you know, I know you're working on distribution now, but whether it's out on Hulu or Prime or whatever, that people say, hey, I want to invite some neighbors over, maybe use some of Joan's methodologies with living room conversations, for example, and say, want to invite 6 neighbors over, 8 neighbors over and watch the film together. Or if you can't do it, you know, in person because of COVID, you do it, you know, online and invite them to watch it with you and then have a conversation, or a virtual or real potluck supper around the film. I'd love to see together and actually digest it together. And the more diverse those groups, the more they can practice what the film's about. And families. I just want to say, since we got, you know, John isn't with us anymore, but the family therapy perspective, I don't know of a single family that if you extend it widely enough, they don't have political disagreements. I mean, you extend it out a couple, you know, circles to your uncles and aunts or nephews and nieces or grandparents, and you've got political diversity. So it can even be a family watch party, you know. And last but not least, I'd love to see other organizations, whether they're churches or synagogues or mosques, say, hey, you know, this relates to what we believe as Christians or Muslims or Jews. This relates to what we believe. Let's have a watch party. So that's my hope for it.
Yeah, and we have faith communities and schools and, you know, groups that are doing monthly conversations. And it's wonderful to have this kind of piece that people can choose to watch ahead of time and have a conversation with that in mind. Because it's a practice. This isn't going to get taken care of in one conversation. It's about really changing our way of being with people that are different than us. And, you know, what I've learned from my faith communities, seeing the divinity in everyone.
I think that's a really good point, which people have to remember is this is not something where we're going to get to a turning point and we'll know we're there and we're done and can move on. This is a continuum, and the conversations will happen, and they have been happening since before this country became a country, you know, in many other countries too. So I guess one of the things maybe, and I don't know how you feel about this, Ben, is that we also need to give ourselves room to understand that although the problems seem intractable now, we can't solve everything right this second. So we need to, you know, the good thing about a film like this is that it can unschool over time, and it is not based in one particular moment in time. And so hopefully, as these conversations continue, it'll ripple out, and the ripple effects will continue for a long time too. But as a filmmaker, when you're creating a film, you also probably think, all right, I'm doing this film, maybe I'll be moving on to my next film at some point. But when you're attached to a film like this, which has its own ethos, its own energy, it's probable that you'll be attached to this for a long time. So how do you feel about that personally?
It's, you know, being a filmmaker I'm really grateful for it. It's a gift to be able to go into someone else's corner of the world and someone else's experience and learn from them and listen to them and tell that story. And so it's actually partially what brought me to this material was to understand, like, this is a journey that we're all on to varying degrees. And, you know, media has been part of the problem. It's been used to divide us, but I also believe it's what can help bring us back together. And, you know, these type of stories, like, you know, people, you know, you could argue that conflict is what sells, and, you know, we're drawn to that. And that's why, you know, news media like can sell advertising. But I also think that transformation is incredibly dramatic. And the fact that you can start on one end of the spectrum and go through learning your own inner prejudices and inner blind spots and say, like, look, how much I've changed and become self-aware in the past 2 years is remarkable. And it's a 2-year journey of making this. I can't imagine a 90-minute experience of just starting on this journey. And we're all on this journey in different degrees. But, you know, this idea, And I think the Leverton said this so beautifully, that there's like a hierarchy of human value that we all have, that certain people are worth more than others. And it's just been kind of taught to us intuitively, and how we sift through that, whether it's gender roles or, you know, sexuality roles or racial divisions. These are things that like all of us are a part of, like whether we know it or not. And so, you know, I think while it's a difficult time that we're in, it's also kind of an opportunity to be challenged in the harshest possible way, to say, where are these blind spots in myself? Because that's all I have control over. And so for me, like, that's what hopefully this film can be, and not in some kind of like, you know, lecture kind of way, but in a very visceral way, to say like, oh my gosh, maybe I'm, you know, I have these blind spots too. And so it is a long journey. And, you know, the impact campaign of doing community screenings and college screenings and virtual screenings and conversations, hopefully will continue beyond the election. It's not just about who wins in November. And they're on full display right now. And, you know, that's why, like you said, this will be a long process, and we're excited to be on it. It's worthwhile conversations to be having.
You know, strategically, sorry, Judy. Strategically, we often talk about the fact that the relationships don't easily scale. Trust doesn't easily scale. Conversations don't easily scale, but norms can scale. And it strikes me that what Ben has created in this Reunited States film is something from a cultural level that can kind of set that norm, that can show us how people around the country in their own way are doing this work. To Mark's point, nothing like that has ever existed. And so I so appreciate you, Ben, and the film for moving us along that spectrum of shifting norms, which I think is the only way we get there. A future in which, you know, we're looking at one another with eyes of common humanity instead of through this dark lens of prejudice and partisanship. You know, what I'm imagining is that instead of combatants, we're seeing compatriots, a nation where we're looking at our neighbors with love and grace, regardless of color or cause or, wait for it, vote, right? That those towards hurting in our midst, that we're looking at them with compassion, toward those fighting for something we don't understand, curiosity, those we don't see things the way we do, humility. And as we've said so many times, that before speaking, we're listening, before judging, we're learning, and before condemnation, we're seeking out conversation. And so my encouragement to all of us and everybody listening would be that together we pursue that vision, that hope, that fervent belief that we can transform this tide of rising rancor, of deepening division, of increasing isolation into instead a wave that we're creating, as we talked about earlier, not the people talking, but all of you and all of us, into this wave of respect, connection, and belonging. And I think that's the direction that the film points us in as a society.
Just want to point out we have about 10 more minutes. So audience, if you have questions, please type them into the Q&A or the chat. But for everybody, sort of, I anticipate, and probably everybody here does too, these next few months are going to get even more challenging as far as the level of rancor and public discourse. How do we, both with this film, but through the work that you're all doing, how do we sort of rise above that and keep ourselves together and not get completely distressed and depressed over what we read every day in the media?
I'll jump in on that and just say that what I do is I surround my people with who I believe in, and I surround myself with people who are doing the kind of work that the folks on this call are doing. And for me, that kind of chorus brings me hope. That doesn't mean sticking myself, my head in the sand and ignoring other people, but to reach out with these values, or what Pearce called norms, to reach out with these norms to other folks. And for example, I'm active in a number of projects that are looking at how do we make sure this election stays clean and honest and responsible and democratic. And that's a very practical thing people can do. There are a lot of organizations doing that kind of work. There are also a lot of local organizations that, in the face of this ugliness at the national level, they're doing things at the community level, like Tru's been doing, and so forth. And so one can create pockets and islands of sanity where you live, because ultimately, if you live in North Carolina matters more than Washington. I live in Colorado. Colorado that's where I am. My children are. My pets are. My daily life is. So making sure your own community, your own region reflects the norms you believe in, reflects the values you believe in, that's a tremendous thing you could do. And I'll just close with this thought that recently they've been saying that we don't have one COVID pandemic. We have many COVID pandemics, and they're different in different parts of the country. That's absolutely true. And I think the same thing is true for conversation. Just because inside the Beltway on Capitol Hill, they have an extremely dysfunctional conversation, doesn't mean that you and I need that, you know? And that's what Pearce's work and Joan's work and Tru's work, that's what everybody's doing, is they're saying, no, we can do it differently. We can do it better. And I think the film is an inspiration to people who haven't seen it. It's an inspiration to say, hey, I'm going to do this because it's actually fun, and I can belong to something I care about. I don't have to be a Democrat or Republican to belong to something. I can also be part of this movement and belong to something, because it is a movement. It wasn't 10, 20 years ago. It is today.
We actually wrote a living room conversation called the Golden Rule in Politics, in partnership with the National Institute for Civil Discourse. And that was so people, after they listened to, in some cases, a sermon on the Golden Rule, they could then have a conversation, just 6 people, on their own personal relationship with that topic. And just the opportunity to reflect on who you want to be and how you want to be at this time. It's really valuable. I always learn something when I have one of these conversations. And I always deepen my connections with, the friends that I have it with, and I meet new people. And at this time when many of us are physically isolated, we don't have to be socially isolated. This is a way to be intentional about, reaching out to people that need connection and having the conversation that's uplifting rather than, ain't it awful? Because ain't it awful is a conversation I hear all the time. It's hard to interrupt. But becoming intentional about the conversations we want to have and encouraging them in the local and in our relationships across the country is just a gift for everyone, honestly.
The final question I have is, so how will we know when we're there? How will we know when we've made progress? What does progress feel like?
Progress for me feels like a culture in which respectful interaction is what we all anticipate. And when people treat each other badly, we're shocked. And those people feel a sense of, oh, I should not have done that. We're not there right now. This is not good.
I would add to that I don't think it's a destination that we're going to arrive at. Like the journey of the more perfect union is the attempt at that every day. And so I guess the measure of that would be, are more and more people doing that? Is there a sense of, respectful disagreement? And, we won't ever fully agree. There's, hundreds of different cultures, religions, races, identities. And the only way that we're held together is with this tolerance and respectful tolerance of each other. And, there's a majority, obviously, that will kind of, vote in elected leaders. And there's obviously structural reforms that can improve the process. But we don't even necessarily have to like each other, but we have to respect each other and each other's differences and views. And so it's not a destination that we'll ever fully get to. Even the founding fathers were very far off from their own ideals, but they set a framework that the rest of us could follow to try and achieve that. And that attempt is what makes it worth it.
Judy, thank you for making this film part of the platform for the festival. You made a good choice, and I hope the festival is a credible success and that this film is part of it. And I'm grateful to you for choosing it, because I think that's one of the ways we'll know that there's a change happening, is when more people say, I want to listen to this kind of story, I want to watch this kind of show. That's going to be people voting with their feet and with their eyes and with their clicks. And so that's one of the ways, Judy, that I think we'll know. Thank you, Judy.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you, everybody. I just want to say, you're all doing amazing work. Thank you, Ben, for making the film. We were thrilled to be able to premiere it at the Woods Hole Film Festival virtually. As I mentioned initially, for people in the audience, if you haven't seen it, it is available on our platform through August 3rd. We hope that we will be able to play some role in also facilitating its entrance further into the world. And we have 187 amazing films. Filmmakers, especially independent filmmakers, put everything they have into getting these stories out so that we can all see them and hopefully think about the issues, particularly with documentaries that are reflected in them, and hopefully change lives. So Ben, I'll give you the last word.
No, I just, this is a really challenging time, and the fact that we can come together and have these conversations, it's truly inspiring. And, everyone here has donated so much time and energy and trust into this film, and we really hope that it can be a small part of giving people hope in a time where it's so badly needed. And so we're looking forward to our events on Saturday. We have a Q&A for the film with a lot of the people, other characters and people that are in the film, for anyone that can join us. And hopefully this is the start of the journey together.
Good afternoon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.